Thanks everyone for coming to this special podcasting for startups presentation by Steph Taylor. Steph is based in Brisbane. Most of us are in Melbourne in lockdown, so it's a good time for an event like this. So before I start, I need to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that we joined today from, so all over Australia. So, and acknowledge their leaders, past, present, and emerging. So thank you so much for coming. I know in chat, the people who joined just now, put in chat where you're from, and feel free to share your LinkedIn, email, website, whatever, however we can connect with you. Before I hand over to Steph, I need to say a little bit about the sponsors who make events like this possible. Companies that sponsor, I normally share their websites, but I'll put them in chat. And those who are watching on the recording will have their links to their websites in the YouTube description below. So the first company that is sponsoring us is Allied Legal. It is a law firm, but much more than a law firm. They are now helping people to scale through sales and business development, strategy, that kind of advice. So check them out at alliedlegal.com.au. The other sponsor is App Demo Videos. App Demo Videos is a technology video company, so they could do videos for your smartphone app, a website, e-commerce, or any technology product to demonstrate how it works. There are a lot of demo videos on their website, appdemovideo.com. Have a look at them. And the third sponsor is Yalma Digital, which is a web design and app development company. They're actually helping Silicon Beach with our website as well. So go to yalmadigital.com.au to and say, all these people, just say that you're from Silicon Beach, you heard about them from Silicon Beach, and you'll get special rates, discounts, and treatment. Thank you. With that, I'll hand over to Steph to share your screen and introduce yourself and start it off.
Sure.
Thanks, Steph.
All right. So can we all see my slides?
Yes, can.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay. Well, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in a second. What I will do is at the end of the whole presentation, we can do questions. If you have questions along the way, feel free to type them in the chat box and we can get to them at the end. But I won't answer them as I go because I can't actually see the chat box. Okay, so hey guys, I'm Steph. I am the host of Socialette, which is a bite-sized online marketing podcast that I launched back in 2018. So I've been at this for 2 years, not quite as long as David, who launched his podcast 15 years ago, but you know, that's 2 years is getting there. And when I launched it, I hit #1 in the Apple Podcast business charts in launch week. 6 months later, I was chatting with podcasting legends, Pat Flynn and Jordan Harbinger on the same stage as them. So currently I'm at about 600,000 downloads and counting. I've managed to fire all my clients and turn my business into a product-based business. And in today's presentation, I'm going to share a little bit about how you can use a podcast to get clients or customers into your startup. So let's jump in because I am conscious there's a lot of content and I imagine we're going to have a lot of questions at the end. So get the most out of this. Make sure you are in a quiet space where you're not going to be disturbed. Make sure to put your phone on airplane mode and make sure to exit out of any tabs if you have them open. You guys seem to be a pretty good bunch. Often when I teach these things, I get people, you know, in their inbox, on social media. So try not to do that. Okay. So you are in the right place today if you've been thinking about launching your podcast for a while, but you haven't made any progress yet. Maybe you've been putting it off forever. It's just been sitting there in the too hard basket. And I was there as well. I think I put it off for about a year or two and it didn't become a reality until I actually started taking that action. You're also in the right place if every time you think of launching a podcast, you instantly feel overwhelmed at how much there is to do. Maybe you're afraid that there are too many podcasts out there already because we keep hearing all these numbers. There's over 1 million podcasts in Apple Podcasts at the moment. Maybe you think you've missed the boat. And I'm going to talk about this one a little bit more in today's presentation. Okay, so a lot of people out there are teaching people how to launch podcasts these days. It's getting to be quite a popular topic. And I believe that what makes me different is that I keep things simple. So I don't believe in going out and investing, thousands of dollars in the fanciest tech and bringing on a full podcast production team and all of that before you've even tested your podcast idea, right? You don't need to have the most expensive, most complicated equipment. You don't need the most comprehensive editing software. You don't need a full audio engineer to be editing every single episode. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as well. But first, I just want you to think a little bit, okay? Can you imagine what it would feel like to be the host of a wildly successful podcast that builds your authority, opens doors to opportunities, and generates income for your startup? Because this is exactly what a podcast can do for you, right? Launching a podcast means you no longer need to spend hours on social media or drop your prices or try and convince people really, really hard to invest in you and spend money on your product, okay? Because it positions you as the go-to in your space. It opens the door to collaborations and speaking opportunities, and it generates income in your business. It means that people seek you out, okay? It's not the other way around. It creates that credibility because everyone can start a blog. Everyone can start an Instagram account, a LinkedIn page, whatever. Everyone can do that. Launching a podcast, there's still a little bit of a barrier to entry, right? It's not something that everyone's doing just yet. It also means that you might get to interview some incredible guests. It might give you access to some super influential people who you never otherwise would have got a foot in the door with. So it can be incredibly powerful to use, not just as a content tool, but as a network development and a business development tool. But before you can successfully launch your podcast, there are a couple of big podcasting myths that you need to stop believing. And these are what generally keep people from launching their podcasts in the first place. So myth number one, podcasting gear has to set you back hundreds or thousands of dollars. So truthfully, more expensive doesn't necessarily mean better. Now, if you wanted to, you could go out, you could spend a fortune on podcasting equipment, but this doesn't necessarily mean that your sound quality is going to be better, because often when you're getting the more expensive setup, it's actually more complicated as well. And that means there's a lot more that can go wrong with it. So if you're just starting out, I pretty much always recommend getting a very simple plug and play microphone that's within your budget. You don't need to have a full mixer setup if you're not comfortable using one of those. A simple, good quality USB condenser microphone is all you need. When I first started my podcast, I made the mistake of dropping $300 on podcasting gear that just wasn't right for me. I had done a little bit of Googling, as you do when you're starting out. You Google, what's the best podcasting microphone? And somebody on the internet told me, this is going to be the best podcasting microphone for all beginners. So I ordered it. I paid a premium to ship it from the US. I waited 3 weeks for it to arrive. I realized it was the wrong power cable, so I went and bought a new power cable for it. And then I plugged it in, set it up, could not figure it out. There were all of these different dials, all of these settings. It didn't sound good. It didn't work. Like, I have a main road right there. It was picking up all of the background noise. So I ended up just scrapping it. It's still sitting here on my shelf. I ended up scrapping it and buying a $100 microphone and using that instead. So you don't need to have super complicated, super expensive equipment. The second myth is editing your podcast episodes has to take a long time and is really complicated. If you wanted to, yes, you could spend, 2 hours editing an episode, but you really don't need to. The first couple of episodes that I released, I edited out every every like, every time I stumbled. My listeners did not notice the minute I stopped editing those things out. They don't notice, they don't care, right? When I stopped spending hours editing all of my episodes, it meant that I could spend that time creating valuable content instead, because that's what people are tuning in for. They're tuning in for the content, not for perfect audio. It's really easy to DIY your own editing as well. If you want, 110% perfect sound quality, yes, you can outsource that to an audio producer, but do your listeners really care if it's 110% perfect? Probably not. They're probably not going to notice. They're going to be listening in their simple Apple headphones. They're not going to notice the tiniest little bit of, tiniest little bit of background noise, tiniest bit of audio that's not perfect. I spend maybe 15 minutes editing my episodes. What I do is when I'm recording, if I stuff up, I'll pause, go back and re-record over it. Or if it's an interview, I'll make a note of the timestamp when the person stuffed up. I'll go back, I'll cut that out, and that's all I'll do. It's a very simple little editing process. Like I said, my audience doesn't care. Most people's audiences won't care unless maybe you're talking to an audience of audio engineers, in which case maybe you want to make it perfect. The third myth, and this is probably the biggest one that holds people back, is this idea that I need to have, more email subscribers, more followers, more, connections on LinkedIn before I can launch my podcast. You're never going to feel like your audience is big enough to launch your podcast. Just like you're never going to feel 100% ready to launch it, you're never going to feel like your audience is big enough. And truthfully, launching your podcast is how you grow your audience. So since launching my podcast in 2018, I've grown my email list probably about 20 times over. And I've more than quadrupled my Instagram following. I couldn't tell, I don't track my LinkedIn numbers, so I couldn't tell you how that's going, but I can tell you that's increased as well. And that's because you start to show up for your audience with a podcast. You're showing up regularly, you're being consistent, and that's how you get those subscribers, those followers, that traction. A podcast really can elevate your audience growth, because if you can turn, just one listener into a raving fan, that listener is going to go and tell their friends about you. And then their friends go and tell their friends about you. And on and on. And that's how your podcast growth starts to snowball if you do it strategically. Myth number 4, it's too late to launch a podcast. There are already too many podcasts. Truthfully, you can stand out by owning your unique magic. Yes, there might be over 1 million podcasts in Apple Podcasts alone, but that doesn't mean that there's no opportunity for you, okay? If you were to launch a podcast that is exactly like everyone else in your industry, then yeah, nobody's going to listen to it because they've already got podcasts giving them those guests that content. So it's all about figuring out what your unique magic is. And that's going to be one big part of today's presentation. And the last one, podcasts are a passing fad. So, I mean, as we heard from David at the beginning while people were joining, I mean, he started a podcast 15 years ago. I don't know of any fads that have been around for 15 years, guys. This is actually something that I hear a lot from friends and family members who don't listen to podcasts, especially before I launched mine. It was, should you be investing so much time in something that's probably not going to be around in a year? Well, let's just say I'm very glad that I did. And I mean, this is last year's stats, right? But from last year's Infinite Dial stats, there were over 144 million people in the US alone who are listening to podcasts. And I know definitely in the last couple of months, that has increased a lot. I don't have the numbers on hand, but it's gone up a lot. Podcasting is becoming a lot more mainstream. And I know this might sound like it's a bad thing, but it's actually a big opportunity because we're starting to see a lot of the mainstream media outlets turning to podcasting as a new platform. Outlets like the ABC, Nova up here in Brisbane. I don't know what the equivalent is in other states, but they're all starting to switch to releasing podcasts, which means that people who would never have otherwise listened to podcasts are starting to listen to them. And actually, like even some of those friends and family members who questioned why I was launching a podcast, they now listen to podcasts as well. So it's actually because, although there are more and more podcasts being launched, there are also more and more people listening to them. Another big reason I believe podcasting isn't a passing fad is because audio is one of the only types of content you can consume while you're multitasking. You can't read a blog post while you're driving. You can't watch a video while you're out jogging. You can listen to audio while you're cleaning the house, while you're showering, while you're, I don't know, working even. The fact that we can listen to podcasts while we're going about our busy lives, that tells me that they're here to stay. Okay, let me know in the chat box if you guys are feeling a little bit more confident now that I've busted through some of these big myths. And if there's anything else that's holding you back from launching your podcast in your mind, I'd love to hear that in the chat box as well. Maybe we can, when we get to the question section at the end, we can get to those now. Where is my chat box disappeared to? There it is. Yeah, David says Spotify are spending hundreds of millions on podcasting. Exactly. I mean, look at how much, I can't remember how much they are paying Joe Rogan for his exclusive, but it's like, it's incredible. They're investing all of this money in it. And that's a big sign that, you know, podcasting is definitely here to stay. Awesome. Over 100 million. That's insane. Over 100 million for an exclusive to one guy's podcast. Robert asks, can you podcast in video, audio or video as well? You can do video podcasts. I don't do video. I don't release video podcasts. Sometimes I'll record the video as well and release it in YouTube rather than as a video podcast. Cool. Okay, let's keep rolling. So like I mentioned, you need to have a podcast topic that stands out if you want to not blend in with everyone else in your industry, because there are over 1 million podcasts, which is a lot. I mean, most of these haven't even made it to 10 episodes. So hopefully that helps you feel a little bit better about it. A lot of people, you know, they'll do 5 episodes, nobody but their mum and their dog has tuned in, and then they give up. So let's make sure that you're not one of those people. The first thing I look at when creating a podcasting strategy is, what are your competitors doing? And this isn't about copying them. This is more to look at how you can do things differently, how you can fill that gap in the quote unquote market, because it's not really a market, but it does work a little bit like one. So firstly, what are they doing well? You know, what's working well with their shows? Is it their topics? Is it their guests? Is it their content? Is it how often they're publishing their podcast? Is it their consistency? Is it how long the episodes are? I want you to really consider these things when you're researching everyone else in the podcasting, in the market, in your industry. Also look at what they're not doing so well. What do you dislike about their shows? So for example, in the business space, pretty much all of the podcasts I was looking at were interviewing the same guests. What would happen is somebody would have a book coming out, they would get interviewed on 20 different business podcasts, and it would be the same stock standard answers to every question. I mean, why is anybody going to listen to that guest on 10 different podcasts with the same content? So look at, you know, how you can maybe get different guests. Maybe you can ask them different questions. When I launched my podcast into the online marketing space, which is one of the most saturated categories out there, I did a bit of research. So I reached out to a couple of past clients and I asked them what they thought of other online marketing podcasts out there. And one thing that a lot of them told me was they didn't have the time to listen to all of these podcasts that were an hour and a half long and that didn't give any actionable advice. They told me that they thought a lot of podcasts took way too long to get to the point. You know, it was half an hour of the host and the guest talking about what the guest had for breakfast, and then it was 5 minutes of actionable advice, and then another hour of rambling on about something completely irrelevant. So what I did instead was I created a no-fluff bite-sized podcast. Instead of doing one episode a week that was 2 hours long or an hour and a half long, I do 3 episodes a week, 5 to 10 minutes long, and occasionally I'll bring in a guest expert for an interview. When I do a longer interview style episode, I make sure that I plan out my questions carefully. I make sure to ask the guest questions that haven't been asked on all of the other podcasts out there. And I make sure that my listeners can still get as much value out of that episode rather than, 45 minutes of just fluff. The next step in getting your standout strategy is to think about what makes you unique. Now, it can be really tempting to try to be like everyone else in your industry, but if you're somebody who likes to wear, bright pink and sparkles in an industry where everyone's wearing suits, try and own that uniqueness. Because if you're trying to pretend that you're this corporate person in a suit, when really deep down you're more about bright pink and sparkles, you're never going to feel 100% comfortable, and your listeners are going to notice. Your audience is going to be able to tell that you're not comfortable. Now, there's nobody else out there that's quite like you, as cliche as that is. You just need to figure out what it is that you bring to the table and then infuse that into your podcast so that you can attract more of the right people. So a couple of questions to get you started to think about this. How would your friends describe you? Also, if you have customers and clients, how would they describe you? Do they know you as the funny person, the loud one, the nerdy one? Whoever you are, you need to own that, right? There's no point pretending to be the funny podcaster just because you think it's going to get you all of the listeners, because you're going to find it exhausting trying to keep that up. If you're using your podcast to educate people, what's your teaching style? Or if you're not using it to educate people, what's your presenting style, right? What unique perspective can you bring? Can you give a fresh take on a topic that's been done to death? Do you maybe have interesting stories you can share? Do you have a journey that is unique, that's brought you to where you are today? Step 3, you need to think about what you want to be known for. Now, a big mistake that I made when I launched my own podcast was I didn't think about what I wanted to be known for. Now, by launching a general marketing podcast, I became known as a generalist marketer. I could do a lot of marketing things, but because I didn't specialize in any one thing in particular, I wasn't seen as an expert in anything in particular. So since niching down, I've seen a huge uptick in sales. I've seen a big spike in podcast download numbers. I've seen a big increase in people asking me to speak at their events like this one. So ask yourself, how can you get even more specific on your topic, right? So for example, rather than launching a podcast about, business coaching, could you launch a podcast on business coaching for people who are launching a tech startup side hustle? So get really, really niche. And this is where people start to question, okay, this is going to limit the number of listeners that I get. And it's a big limiting belief that most of us deal with. And I definitely had to work through this one when I niched down as well. But truthfully, there are so many people out there. Okay. By niching down your podcasting topic, you're going to attract people who are 100% interested in your topic. And these people are much more likely to become paying customers of yours, which is what the ultimate goal of launching a podcast for your startup is going to be, right? Okay, I want you guys to jump back into the chat box. Give me a yes if you're thinking that it's simple. Give me a no if it's not. I can see, okay, some questions are popping in there. So I'll go through and I will answer the questions when we get to the very end. Good to see there's some yeses. Would have been awkward if that was a no. Okay, now the really crucial part is how you're going to leverage your podcast to promote your startup once you've launched it. Now, it can be a really effective way to generate leads for your startup. It can be a really effective way to open the door to meet people, to build your startup brand. And here is how you're going to do it, right? So the first option is to sponsor your own show. Now, you might see this might play out like this episode is brought to you by, and then you talk about your startup. It's quite a good way to do it. It is really good for brand awareness and recall because your listeners are constantly hearing your startup's name. But you can't just consider that people are going to hear it once and then pop over to your website and buy your product, because that's generally not how it's going to work. It's going to take multiple touch points before they are ready to buy from you. And that is where the second option comes into play, right? So this is where you would be giving away something for free. The goal here is that you're using your podcast to build an email list where you can then continue to nurture those people into eventually becoming paying customers. So for example, something you could give away for free might be a free trial. If you have a software-based business, it might be, 7-day free trial. It could be bonus content. It could be a Facebook community, or it could be free events. It could be a webinar. Any of these things where somebody can opt in, give you their email address and get on your email list, anything like that is perfect. The third way to use your podcast to generate some leads is to interview target customers. So perhaps you have a big key customer that you want to get on board. If you can't get any time for a meeting with this person, reach out to them and ask them for an interview. You're getting to spend an hour with somebody who you otherwise wouldn't have a chance to talk with. That's a really good way to start chatting to them. You can say, well, hey, look, this is what we do. Start to talk a little bit about how your product might be able to benefit them. Remember, this is about them. It's not about you. It's about them. It's about what you can do for them. And start to build that connection. It might not happen straight away, but it's a really good way to get that foot in the door. I'd love to know in the chat box, which option or options will you choose? And there is one correct answer, and that is all three, ideally. But it's not, obviously not everyone's going to go with all three. Okay, let's jump into some of the Q&A, because I know you guys will have a lot of questions, and I wanted to keep the content as light as possible, because often the questions are where, you guys need the most help. So please jump in. I know there was another question I missed previously. Oh, here we go. Okay, so what if you have no guests? My area is peculiar to my own knowledge, the origin and evolution of the universe. You don't need to have guests in your podcast at all. There is no rule saying you have to have guests. And I mean, I personally have found my podcast has done particularly well without any guests. What I would do is reach out to a few people who you think might be like your ideal listener. So somebody who you think would be the kind of person who's going to listen to your podcast, and ask them, say, hey, would you rather hear from me, or would you prefer an interview-based podcast? Because we can think that we know what's right, what our listeners are going to like, but until we actually get out there and ask them, we're just guessing. Okay. Is the podcast name super important? Yes, it is. So a couple of things I like to look for in a podcast name is it needs to be really easy to spell, because often a really good way of growing your podcast is to get interviewed on other people's podcasts. And when you're getting interviewed on other people's podcasts, they're going to ask you what your podcast is called, and you're going to tell them the name. If it's something that's really difficult to spell, people aren't going to be able to find your podcast in Apple Podcasts or in Spotify or wherever they're looking, because they're going to spell it wrong. And this is actually a mistake that I made with my own podcast. A lot of people think socialette is spelt like socialite. It's not. So I have to sometimes explain to people how it's spelled. So that's one thing. Another thing you want to consider is that it's not trademarked, that the domain is free, nobody else has the same name. You also want to consider whether you really need to include the and podcast. So for example, the Socialette podcast instead of just Socialette, because it makes it a lot harder for people to search for. The search engine algorithms in the podcasting apps aren't great. And sometimes it can be the difference between your podcast showing up and not showing up when somebody searches for it. And I guess the other thing is there is a little bit of SEO involved in the name. So if you can give it a name that's got some keywords in it, that's even better. Cool. Okay. What if you don't like the sound of your voice? Oh, I love this question. Okay. I used to hate the sound of my voice, and I actually feel like podcasting has been the best thing I've ever done for my voice. I've lived in multiple countries, and I've always been the kid that had the weird accent that spoke funny. So it's only since launching my podcast that I've actually learned to start enjoying my voice. The key thing is to realize it's not about your voice. It's not so much about you. It's about the people that you're helping. And you can't help anyone until you get over that self-consciousness about your voice. They're not even going to notice. Other people don't care what your voice sounds like. They just care about the content that you're giving them. I can see David's already answered that, Liz. You get used to it. You definitely do. And you can take my approach to editing. I don't listen to my episodes most of the time before I upload them. I just cut out the mistakes and that's it. I can't listen to them. What software do you use to produce, edit, and post it online? Okay, I go very, very basic. I generally recommend Audacity is a good free version if you're just starting out. A lot of people say, you've got to use Adobe Audition. It's really complicated. It takes a long time to learn. You don't need to learn it. Audacity, if you have a Mac, GarageBand is fine. There's another free one I've started playing around with called Bouncecast. It uses AI to make it sound nice. It does a pretty good job with the audio. What I use to post it online. So once I've exported the episode out of Audacity or GarageBand or Bouncecast, I'll run it through an app called Orphonic, which levels out the sound volume. So, when you're listening to one song and then it goes to the next song and suddenly you blow your eardrums out. Orphonic stops it from doing that. It keeps it at the same level of sound. It also adds on the intro and the outro for me, so I don't have to add that in manually. And then it exports it out to the app thing. I don't know what it's called. I guess the platform is probably the right word for it, that I use to host my podcast, which is called Libsyn, Libsyn. Libsyn is, I think, about $5 a month is the cheap version. There is another one that's free called Anchor. I don't recommend Anchor because there is a clause in their terms of service that allows them to use your content however they wish. So they can insert any ads that they like. They can use your content in their ads. They basically own your content. So you don't want that. Cool. Okay. What if most of your target audience generally don't listen to podcasts? Okay. So I would question then, firstly, whether podcasting is going to be the right use of your time. Maybe it's worth looking at where your audience hangs out and meeting them over there. So if they are reading blogs, maybe it's a better investment of your time to write blog posts. If they are watching YouTube videos, maybe you need to be over there. That's probably the best way to do it. Otherwise, you can educate your audience on podcasts. You can start to show them how a podcast works. A lot of people in my audience didn't realize podcasts were free. So there's always that little bit of education you need to do with people who aren't familiar with them. If you already have an audience, then educating them is fine. If you don't already have an audience, then you're going to be a little bit stuck because you're publishing these episodes and you don't have people that you can easily educate and bring them over into podcasts. So I hope that answers that one. If you have a website, you can host your own files. You can, but it slows down your website bandwidth big time. I wouldn't recommend it because Google likes websites that are nice and fast. And if lots of people are listening to your podcast on your website, it's slowing it down. I'll type into the chat the editing tool that I use GarageBand personally, but I'll type in Audacity, Orphonic, and Bouncecast. Do we have any other questions, guys?
What we can do is, Steph, we can stop the recording there and ask people to unmute themselves and ask questions, just like in a real presentation. How about that?
Let's do that. Love that idea.
Yeah. Okay. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to stop the recording. So thanks to everyone who's been watching on the recording so far. Before I stop the recording, let me take a photo. It's so nice, everyone, Karen, can you take a photo as well? Because I'm on iPad, I can't see more than 9 people, I think. Okay.
Sure can. I'm going to count you down. 3,
Yeah.
2, 1. Smile. Now keep smiling because I'm doing 3 shots. Everyone smile. And 1 more. That's how many's on here. Love it.
Yeah. It's a good session. Very, very informative. Okay. Thanks, everyone. We can continue asking questions, but I'm going to stop the recording there. Thanks, Steph.